Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome Lisa Najavits. She's a PhD, Director of Treatment Innovations, and Adjunct Professor at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. She was on the faculty of Harvard Medical School for 25 years and was a research psychologist at the Veterans Affairs Healthcare System in Boston for 12 years. Her major clinical and research interests are substance abuse, trauma, co-morbidity, and behavioral addictions. We're just really excited about this. What I can tell you is we are going to put a link to Lisa's website in the chat, and it'll include wonderful information about her important work. And if you are already a part of our WhatsApp pages, you can click on some information Patrick sent out early this morning or late last night that'll further explain her work. The title for today's workshop is taken from the name of her latest book, which is Finding Your Best Self, Recovery from Addiction, Trauma, or Both. This book sets out a step-by-step road to recovery from the enslavement of trauma and addiction. And we are so grateful to Lisa for generously offering to come along today to share this roadmap with us. By the way, you can find the book on Amazon. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Lisa. Thank you so much for coming to see us. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. And most of all, a thank you to your entire organization and to everyone who has shown up today, or whoever listens to this in the future. Time is the ultimate resource, and I appreciate your time. And I hope to make it valuable today by going into some aspects of this model. And let me be very clear, I have no interest in promoting or pushing any kind of agenda in terms of this being, the model. There are many, many models out there. This is just one piece of the elephant, as they say. It's just one particular view of a topic I feel very dearly about, which is how to help people who have both trauma and addiction. And this is an area I've been in for over 30 years. And some people may be familiar with a model I developed, published in 2002, called Seeking Safety. This model, Finding Your Best Self, is completely distinct from that one, and I'll go into what is distinct and different. But the overview framework today is whether or not you end up looking at this model, I think some of the principles will apply that you can apply to your own recovery and apply to the people that you are trying to help. That is our shared goal. And throughout my work, I have always come from a very public health-oriented perspective. I've done academic work, been a researcher, done clinical trials, trying to improve care, developed models, including this one, Finding Your Best Self, that we'll be talking about today, have always continued to do clinical work, and all three of these have interconnected. So you may know, if you began your recovery or your work in this area decades ago when I did, that this field has grown dramatically. Back in the early 90s, there was just the beginning of understanding and focus on what we now call co-occurring disorders. So if someone has, for example, both an addiction-related disorder and, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, or anxiety disorders, or any other type, there was a growing focus on how can we address anything the person is struggling with, not segmenting things the way that it used to be. And sometimes still is, where sometimes it's focused just on one or just on the other, and the person can get a bit lost in that process, almost as if they're sort of split, only being able to look at one side of their experience. So the framework in Finding Your Best Self, and really in all the work that I've devoted myself to in these many years, is how to address whatever the person is walking in with. So we're going to be talking about tools. This is a very practical model that's designed for any setting, any provider, if it is being delivered in some sort of context where one person is helping another, or any individual. It was designed as a self-help model, as well as something that could be delivered from one person to another. And the one to another could be any context. For example, it could be a 12-step sponsor with a sponsee. It could be certainly any professional setting. It could be peer-led delivery of services. It could be a family member. We certainly know family members often are struggling with how to help their loved ones. It could be a friend. So when we think about all that we're going to talk about now, it's in this broad context. And part of this comes from my very humble recognition that most people who struggle with trauma and or addiction never end up in formal treatment due to a wide variety of issues, sometimes due to finances or resources or insurance, sometimes due to fear of going into a professional setting or just access if they live in a rural area. Whatever it may be, one of my goals in writing this book was how to try to help people no matter where they are. So starting with what is trauma, probably a very familiar term to people. One really terrific development over these past several decades has been the now mainstream awareness of trauma. But back in the early 90s, there was very little recognition of it, and certainly very little in relation to addiction. There is no one definition of trauma. The three that I tend to go to, but each one is slightly different, come from the three major professional organizations that have defined it. So from the DSM-5 being the American Psychiatric Book that defines diagnoses. It stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, edition number 5. That has the most narrow definition, and it was originally developed on people coming back from combat, from war. The experience, threat, or witnessing of death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And when they talk about injury here, they mean physical injury. And that definition leaves out a lot of important kinds of traumas or stressors that people may experience, such as emotional abuse, which some people feel was far more damaging than physical events for them, or non-physical bullying, discrimination, or poverty, or all sorts of other aspects that some people react to very intensely and adversely. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, has probably the broadest definition: events experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. A beautiful definition in terms of day-to-day usage. And the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, which is used more globally, edition 11, an extremely threatening or horrific event or series of events. So a nice, concise, and simultaneously broad definition. I'm not going to go here into the definition of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It may already be familiar, or you can go ahead and find it online. It's very easily accessible. But focusing now on the impact of trauma, how it shows up. And one of the many ways that it shows up is in addictive behavior. Tremendous linkages between trauma and addiction, sometimes called numbing the pain, using as a way to comfort, as a way to soothe, as a way to escape from memories or emotions. It certainly also goes the other direction. Addiction sets people up for trauma, being around people who may be unsafe, being in drug-related, for example, situations that may be in bad neighborhoods or criminal activities that set people up for some sort of violence or driving under the influence. And certainly for some people, both issues were there early on in their families, families where both trauma and addiction were present. Whatever the pathway, these tend to be highly related for many people. And in thinking about trauma-related symptoms, as we said, we won't go into the definition, but just being aware of how it shows up, whether it's in a formal diagnosis. Some people do get diagnosed with PTSD or acute stress disorder or dissociative identity disorder. Any of those are the most typical diagnoses that might arise from trauma. But it shows up in many other ways as well, and now identified in the ICD-11 as complex PTSD, which has been a long time coming, but represents people who lived with, as it's often said, too many to count kinds of traumas, sometimes as part of domestic violence or child abuse. So I won't read all these, you can see them on the screen, but as we think about how to heal, recognizing what symptoms the person is struggling with. And also another key framework are stages of recovery from trauma. And if you haven't already read it, one of the key books in this area of work is Judith Herman's classic book called Trauma and Recovery, published in 1992, translated in numerous languages. And it really broke open this field of trauma. And she reviewed over 100 years of clinical description of how people recover and basically identified 3 core types of work. And we now think of them not so much as sequential stages, but different types of work. Safety being staying in the present, working on coping skills, learning about identifying what symptoms and problems the person has, helping them get out of unsafe behaviors, whether that's addiction or any other. Mourning, which she called mourning and remembrance, is facing the past in the sense of moving into that trauma narrative, telling the story, feeling through those emotions and memories. And finally, reconnection, facing the future, establishing a good set of connections and a good set of mission or purpose in life. And so basically, in finding your best self, which we'll now move into, it has elements of all 3, but it's very much designed to be non-triggering because it can be done as self-help or with any helper. And so far, we've never heard of people having adverse events or being overly triggered or distressed by the material in this model. And I'll just highlight for a moment this true or false question. Do clients have to tell their trauma story to fully heal? Clients, we could substitute the word people here. Does a person have to tell their story to heal? And the answer to that is no. Sometimes people assume that working on trauma means moving into that painful, detailed narrative of trauma. Who did what, at what ages, exactly what did they do, how did you respond and all of that. But that can actually, it's sometimes called opening Pandora's box, that can actually open up a flood of emotion and memory that may not be right for the person to go into at this point. For example, if they're currently in early recovery from addiction, this may not be the time for that. Or it may never be the time for that. Some people that's not the work that they want to do, and it's not needed for healing. So just recognizing, just as with addiction, there are many pathways, with trauma as well, there are many pathways. So not pushing someone to go ahead and tell the trauma narrative, that can actually cause negative impact if someone isn't trained to do that work, or it opens it up at a time that the person really isn't ready to handle the impact, or they just don't want to go there. A few resources to mention. If you haven't seen it already, tip 57, you can just Google that term. It's called Trauma-Informed Care in Behavioral Health Settings. It's a free download, and it is a several hundred-page clinically focused, meaning really for on the ground. It's not an academic text, really frontline help for how to help imbue trauma information and trauma-informed care into whatever work anyone is doing. So a lot of resources in that, and I really encourage you to take a look and download, share it, and so on. 2 other resources, these are US-based, but they do tend to also have a lot of information more broadly globally. National Child Traumatic Stress Network, nctsn.org, has a lot of information for families, children, adolescents. National Center for PTSD, ptsd.va.gov, designed basically for, originally for military, and veterans, but basically has a lot of other information, especially around assessment tools. And I included an article. I'll just briefly share that with you. An article on PTSD, substance abuse, and sort of considerations from a public health standpoint. So it's this article, which I published with some really wonderful and esteemed colleagues in the addiction field, where we took the approach of, if you're going to work on trauma and addiction at the same time, how to really take into account the addiction piece of it. Sometimes people who aren't experienced in addiction may take approaches that maybe aren't so useful or could be improved. And so if you can see on the left menu, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it goes into every model that has had a published manual that relates to PTSD. SUD here stands for substance use disorder, that has been published, and then models that have not been published. And the most important part here, I believe, is this one: considerations when selecting a model. And as we said at the beginning, there are a variety of models out there. No one model is a magic bullet or anything of that sort, and the more the better. So it just has considerations here, like consider how the model was tested. Sometimes it was tested in the context of only one type of a more, like, let's say, mild alcohol problems rather than the broad range of more severe problems or drug use disorders. And as we talk about addiction, of course, we also want to take into account behavioral addictions, gambling disorder, binge eating disorder, internet, pornography, sex addiction, all the many variations of 12-step groups, for example. So just recognizing that the field is still at an early stage. I won't go into all of these, but just considerations worth keeping in mind. Is it a model that's been conducted in group or only for individual, and so on. So let me get back then to these slides, and we'll go back to now launching into talking about the model itself of finding your best self. So this model, as we mentioned, if you're familiar with Seeking Safety, this is completely separate from it. This was designed with 35 short chapters, short, so that each one is one little lens onto a different angle of trauma and or addiction. And as you can see in the title, it has a picture of the book cover here. As you can see in the title, it says addiction, trauma, or both. So someone could have just one issue, just the other, or have both issues. A lot of exercises. And then one of my favorite parts is recovery voices, which are, I was very privileged to have people who themselves were in recovery who read one of the chapters and then commented on how that chapter related to their own recovery. And it really is voices from different types of trauma, different types of addiction, different paths in life, different ethnicities and gender and experiences. So that's one of my favorite parts. Reflection questions are basically the questions I would ask if I were in the room with the person, and just designed to help connect it back to the person's own experience. A book itself is inert. It's just words on a page, but it's how it comes alive in the spirit of the person using it. So reflection is designed to help increase that. As we said, it's flexible. Anyone can do it. Self-help or led by a counselor or anyone else, peer, sponsor, friend, family member, and so on. Chapters can be done in any order. It's very much go in and find what is relevant at that time for that particular person, designed to be culturally sensitive, has what I think are unique topics that I have not seen published elsewhere. We'll look at those in a moment, and designed to be very low cost. And so let's take a moment, and I'm going to go to the second handout that I shared with you for today. And if anyone has difficulty accessing the handouts, please feel free to make that note in the chat, but I'll show it here and then hopefully people can access it. But this first part actually has the full table of contents. What are the 35 chapters? And I won't go into all of these. I'll just highlight a few of them here. So very much at the beginning, trying to create legitimate, genuine, realistic inspiration that recovery is possible. And we certainly know this is true for both addiction and for trauma. And then this one, chapter 3, Things Turn Out Okay, David's Experience, is a full chapter of a man named David who had experienced very severe trauma, very severe addiction, and wrote about his experiences in a way that so far no one has ever said has been triggering for them. It's not super detailed about the trauma or addiction, but he does describe a little bit about it for context and then talks about his recovery process, and just very beautiful work that he did and that he has shared. Goes into definitions. Some people view addiction as, let's say, having a medical diagnosis, and wherever anyone stands on that, basically just trying to identify what are some of the key characteristics and moving away from these messages that unfortunately have stigmatized people for so long, crazy, lazy, or bad. And of course, trying to shift away towards a compassionate, much more objective view of addiction and trauma. How do people change? I really tried to explore what are the main mechanisms of change, aside from any, let's say, brand names or model names, but what are the core mechanisms by which that can come about, and how to help people launch the kinds of change that will really move them forward. The World is Your School is basically sort of providing a lot of online resources of learning from others' recovery experiences around trauma and around addiction. Just a few others that I'll highlight. I'll give you this one as a full example of a chapter. This one is one of my favorites, called Wish versus Reality. We'll come back to some more on the list, but for now, just to see what does a chapter look like. By the way, there's some references here. There's also the website that you can go to. That also has my contact information and so on. So just FYI for further info. But if we move on and we look at this, this is, as it says at the top, example of a complete chapter from this model, Finding Your Best Self. And every chapter starts with a quotation. I think that's often very emotionally powerful. This one is from the American humorist Garrison Keillor, who said, "Sometimes you have to look reality in the eye and deny it." And we certainly know with both trauma and addiction, it is difficult to face the full brunt of reality around those issues. And so what we do here at the beginning, each chapter has some background context for setting the frame, the emotional tone of the chapter, and basically trying to sort of set out that denial or minimization, shame, guilt, all those things that prevent people from really fully owning their issues, that's completely normal, completely common in early recovery. And for a lot of reasons that make sense psychologically, wanting to make it better than it is, wanting control, wanting to believe, wanting it to disappear, wanting to feel normal, wanting it to make sense, to fit in, sometimes wanting to make it worse than it is, wanting to be stronger.
Lisa,
yes.
We only see the full deck of cards of pages. Can you focus on the page you're talking about?
Well, that's interesting. Hold on, let me do a new share.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm very glad you did. Thank you so much. It should be sharing this, should say Wish versus Reality at the top.
Yes, it does. It does
now.
Oh,
it does now. Okay, thank you. And just for what was missed, I'll just mention it's up here. We were walking through some of these, some of the table of contents. So we were talking about some of these. And then we mentioned briefly this further information, also contact information, references, and then we were moving into this chapter. So, all right, glad we're on the same page, literally. So by way of, this is, again, the first page or so is just background, and really trying to invite the person in. There's so much shame and blame, of course, in trauma and addiction. And so trying to really help the person, as it says here, build courage to look squarely at these issues and face what's very hard to admit, like I could never have another drink, or my mother knew what was going on and didn't stop it. And so it goes on for a bit, talking about what that's like, talking about, how your mind was trying to protect you from truth, because it does require effort and sometimes, pain to face these things. And then always a lot of specific examples. And in every chapter, examples that relate to both trauma and addiction. Here, starting with some addiction examples. For example, if we take on the right-hand side, not facing the truth, my drinking isn't all that bad, I'll quit tomorrow, I can stop anytime. And on the left, well, my liver function test is showing a problem, I have to start today, even if in small steps, I need help, and so on. And then it goes down to trauma examples. I won't read them, but you can see them here. Similarly, not facing the truth and facing the truth. And then what it feels like, questions that help, and really just always trying to evoke. It's not a linear path, it's not a rigid pathway, but it's really just trying to evoke. For example, which of these questions might be meaningful to address and to start talking about. And then basically it goes on. Every chapter has some sort of this thing called Explore, which is an exercise of some kind. So just a simple exercise, and then always ending with this section, Recovery Voices, and describing just in the person's own words, direct quotes about what that chapter means to them. So basically, that is an example of one full chapter. And that was this one, Wish versus Reality. I'll just highlight a few others just to get a sense of them. Find Your Way is about the idea there is no one path for healing. And the phrase many roads, one journey captures that in a concise way. Basically here, trying to provide guidance that how to find some resources for finding help and how to legitimize your own reactions. If some method doesn't work, don't feel you have to stay in it, trying to explore and viewing treatment and recovery options as a buffet to choose from. The language of trauma and addiction really speaks to the importance of language, and it has a fun exercise called a scavenger hunt, where the idea is to test one's knowledge of important concepts in trauma and addiction. So I'll go to the slides for that. Let me do a new share. Hopefully this time the share will happen correctly. So let me go here. Just to highlight the language of trauma and addiction. So we sort of do, and if you cannot see the PowerPoint slides, please let me know. But hopefully you can see these. The language of trauma and addiction, reading row 1 versus row 2. I won't read them out loud, but you can very clearly see the difference in what it feels like in row 1 versus row 2. And then going on, this can be done as a therapeutic game. It can be done individually, it can be done in group, pairs, whatever it may be, but it's a scavenger hunt. And for example, even noticing right now, just within yourself, we're not going to do this as an exercise, but just noticing, are all these phrases familiar to you? These are all important concepts and language in the addiction field. And I'll leave it up for a moment, and then I'm going to move in a second to some trauma-related concepts. And the list in the actual book goes on a lot longer than this. These are just a couple. But often when I'm training professionals, many professionals don't know all of these terms, and certainly new terms are always coming up. In trauma, these are, again, an excerpt of 10 different concepts and language in the area of trauma. And just noticing for a moment, are any of these unfamiliar? And the idea is all of us are always continually learning, and that also helps feed recovery. Let me go now back to the our list here, and just to walk through a couple others. This is sort of like an overview, and then certainly we can go into more of these in our discussion time. Safe coping skills. This is actually pulled from the Seeking Safety model. There are only 2 of the 35 chapters that have any linkage to seeking safety. Just for anyone who doesn't know, Seeking Safety is an evidence-based model that's used a lot in trauma and addiction recovery. And one of the things in it is this list of safe coping skills. So that's reproduced here because it's just one of the favorite parts of that model. The other one is this one called Chapter 18, Getting to a Calm Place, the Skill of Grounding. That's another really core element for trauma and addiction recovery, and that comes from Seeking Safety. All the other topics are not. Social pain, a topic that often is not sufficiently covered, I believe, which is about, research has shown that the physiological response to social pain is identical to the physiological response to physical pain. Social pain being things like exclusion, discrimination, being stigmatized, being bullied, being ostracized, which sadly occur in both trauma and addiction way too frequently. Self-compassion, we talk about that, often one of the hardest things for people to get to because of so much self-blame in trauma and addiction. Why the 2 things go together, really those linkages we already spoke about. Forgiving yourself, also another very hard task. Body and biology, I'll show you briefly an excerpt from that, which is it's here. This is a questionnaire trying to get at just a simple questionnaire. It's not designed for research. It's really designed to just be helpful in terms of recovery, really noticing your relationship with your own body. So as you can see here, I won't read them all, but everything gets rated 0, not at all, to a lot. Are you physically healthy? Do you take care of your body? Feel positive about sex? Have any current physically oriented addictions? There are many physically oriented addictions. Stress, self-harm, feeling safe in one's body, body image, high-risk physical activities, being touched, awareness of body, medical care, and so on. So just, here again, it's in this model, the idea is very practical kinds of approaches while also always relating back to trauma and addiction at that higher, bigger level. We mentioned the skill of grounding, a key skill, hopefully familiar to people. If it's not, there are many options on the web and elsewhere for grounding, but it is a key skill for shifting any intense negative feeling into a calmer place. Culture of silence. The topic of silencing is so huge, often institutional in some families, in school systems, we've certainly seen all over the news in the past decade, some religious entities, in sports teams, in corporations, that institutions of various levels and kinds tend to create silencing around trauma and addiction. And so exploring that topic here. Motivation, often people are much more motivated to work on trauma than they are to work on addiction, especially early in recovery. And so the idea here is whatever the person is most motivated on, leverage one problem to help the other. In other words, if they're more motivated on trauma recovery, help them see how reducing or eliminating addictive behavior can help them with their trauma recovery. And eventually they'll also get more motivated on the addiction recovery piece, or vice versa, whichever way it goes, but really exploring motivation. This is sort of a framework for having a specific concrete plan, so that it's not just a vague idea of, I'll use less or do that activity less, but it really is how recovery will actually show up in terms of the week ahead, in terms of specific behaviors. Every child is a detective is the idea that childhood so often was the origin of a lot of issues around trauma and addiction. And it opens with this beautiful quote. I'd have to look up the author's name, but she wrote a beautiful book. But the quote is, every family is a mystery, and every child is a detective. And very much holds all the more true for people who grow up in homes where trauma or addiction are present, and they're trying to manage and respond to the overwhelming nature of those aspects. How to survive a relapse, just suggestions for getting back on track so it doesn't get worse. See the link, again, more on how to see the connections between trauma and addiction. Practice is role-playing or rehearsing in some fashion, different scenarios. The next two are two of my favorites that I think often are not addressed sometimes in treatment, which is identity and perception. Identity is how you view yourself. What is the story you say about who you are? How do you define yourself? Perception is how others view you. And both of these can be the source of both growth or of pain. And so here, kind of looking, are you the black sheep in the family? Are you the strong, the strong one who had to be strong throughout childhood and take care of your siblings, and you can never show weakness, whatever it might be. Perception goes back again to, sometimes are very highly stigmatized issues, and how to gain support from others. The decision to grow is about different ways of growing. This next one, also one I think is often underaddressed, dark feelings, rage, hatred, revenge, bitterness. And these do come up, of course, in human experience generally, but also when people have suffered a lot of pain. And so trying to own and recognize, validate these, and also identify how not to turn them into behaviors that will hurt self or others. Imagination, a very powerful tool in recovery, and there are various imaginative exercises. But this model is not technique-oriented per se. It's not sort of just focused on specific techniques, but really also how to inspire and use different parts of the self to do recovery. So some people are very visually oriented, and imagination can be very powerful. For example, create a healing image, another, I think, really powerful method. It's often used in healthcare now for women or people who are pregnant, who are delivering babies, for severe dental care, for cancer, and also in mental health, that creating images that can be sources of support to help the person through it, whether that's a superhero or escaping in some sort of fashion or getting support. Many, many ways of healing images. Find a good counselor has a scale for measuring therapeutic alliance, with the idea that research shows that by the third session of any treatment, how someone feels about it predicts how they'll feel even much later. So if there's not a good sense of connection and gain from that treatment early on, it might be, maybe working it out with the person, or maybe shopping around, but really validating that getting someone with whom one is a really good fit, and whatever type. It doesn't have to be professional help. It can be sponsor-sponsee. It can be 12-step groups, whatever it may be. Two types of trauma counseling goes into, in more detail, what we spoke about earlier on, which is that idea of present-focused recovery versus past-focused. In other words, staying in the present and working on coping skills, or going into the past and telling the narrative. And it just goes into some of the ideas we spoke about already related to that. What the wounded can give back is the very beautiful phenomenon that many people, as they move on in recovery, do often give back to others. And so becoming a helper or healer for other people, whether that's as part of volunteering as part of 12-step groups, or becoming a a trauma advocate or a hotline worker, or whatever it may be, but just being aware of how wounds can become sources of strength. And then the last chapter, 35, is in quote marks. It's a quote from Oscar Wilde, who himself suffered very severe trauma and addiction. He was a 19th century British writer. And this is from a famous poem of his called The Ballad of Reading Gaol. He was imprisoned for a very long time for being gay. And basically, he said, we are all in the gutter, and some of us are looking at the stars. So I think just a very beautiful quote. And the chapter goes into really, how to keep moving forward in recovery. Several other aspects here, just to mention. Appendix A is how others can help. And it's a fairly lengthy chapter that really goes into a lot of the specifics that occur for helpers around struggles that come up for them emotionally, and some of the, the safety and emergency issues and the distress and so on. Giving ideas for how to respond to the person they're trying to help in ways that are productive, but also setting boundaries and learning about resources like Al-Anon and so on. How to conduct, Appendix B is how to conduct finding your best self as a counseling or peer model. Again, this model can be used as self-help. Anyone can pick it up, can go through it with somebody else, but sometimes it is done, let's say, more formally. And here it goes into having a check-in and then going through the material and having a checkout. It sort of just creates a frame for doing the work and some ideas on that. Resources are exactly what that sounds like, a variety of helping tools and websites and all the rest. Appendix D, excessive behavior scale, I developed because I couldn't find a single scale that got at multiple different types of addiction at the same time in an efficient way. So here it goes into, I'll show it to you briefly. Here it is. So basically the idea that almost any problem can become, almost any behavior can become a problem if it's engaged in too much. And as you'll see in this list, it goes into, after a long literature search, identifying a lot of different types of addictive behaviors. Certainly some are in the DSM or formally diagnosed, but most of them aren't. So gambling, alcohol, drugs, work, leisure activities of all kinds, exercise, food, electronics, body improvements such as tattooing or surgery or tanning, nervous habits, sex-related activities, aspects of money, hurting oneself or others, criminal activity, relationships, specific emotions, and so on. So the first part is asking the person, does it seem like any of these behaviors may or are excessive for them for the past month, for at least 1 month in the past year? And basically then anything they say maybe or yes to, the idea is then to go into more depth. So if they said yes to self-harm, then they would go on and rate self-harm in terms of each of these 7 questions, which are key signs of an addiction. And it's not that there's a very firm cutoff. Oh, if you say yes to 3 of these, or you score it as 15 or whatever it may be, you definitely have an issue. But it is sort of notable and trying to help the person, maybe get some help for that. So it goes into that. And basically it's called excessive behavior, not addictive behavior, because many people won't define a behavior as addiction. That's a very heavy duty term that can be very off-putting. So the idea here is it's a behavior that feels potentially excessive or harmful to the person. So that's what that measure is. That was Appendix D. And finally, Appendix E is a brief quiz on trauma and addiction, just sort of testing knowledge, key aspects of that.